Imagine walking into a cathedral of stone, where silence isn't just requested, it's enforced with the precision of a death sentence. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 with $62,000, nearly $2 million in today's money, and a revolutionary promise. Criminals could be saved through complete isolation from the human race. For 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, prisoners lived in cells measuring exactly 8 by 12 feet. No conversation, no human contact, no sound except their own thoughts slowly eating them alive. Charles Dickens called it torture, more refined than anything devised by the Inquisition. European visitors fled in horror. Even the guards began resigning, unable to witness what solitary confinement was doing to the human mind. But the machine kept running. For decades, because too much money had been spent, too many reputations staked on proving that isolation could purify the criminal soul. What they created instead was a factory for manufacturing madness, a place where sane men entered and broken shells of human beings emerged, if they emerged at all. Today we're opening the sealed medical files, the suppressed government reports, and the personal accounts that reveal exactly what happened inside America's most famous prison. This is the true story of how good intentions paved the road to a very specific kind of hell, and why the experiment that was supposed to save criminals' souls ended up destroying their minds instead. If you're ready to uncover the dark science behind solitary confinement and discover how an institution built on Quaker compassion became a laboratory for psychological torture, then settle in. Because this story goes deeper than you think, and the lessons it teaches about human nature and institutional power are more relevant today than ever before. The year was 1829. In the heart of Philadelphia, where cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant hum of industry, a revolutionary idea was taking shape. Not in the grand halls of Congress or the marble chambers of justice, but in the mind of a Quaker reformer named Roberts Vaux. He believed something radical, that criminals could be reformed, not just punished, that the human soul, no matter how darkened by sin, could be cleansed through solitude, reflection, and divine intervention. The Pennsylvania legislature had allocated $62,000, equivalent to nearly $2 million today, to build something the world had never seen before. Eastern State Penitentiary would not be a dungeon of despair, but a cathedral of redemption. Its very name whispered promise. Penitentiary, from the Latin penitentia, meaning repentance. But somewhere between vision and reality, between hope and stone, something went terribly wrong. The architect they chose was John Haviland, a man whose previous works included elegant churches and stately homes. But this commission would demand something different entirely. Haviland spent months studying European prisons, poring over reports from London's Millbank and reading philosophical treatises on the nature of criminal reform. What he designed was unprecedented, a fortress that would serve as both prison and monastery, where inmates would live in complete isolation, seeing no human face save that of their warden, hearing no voice but their own thoughts echoing off stone walls. The construction began in the spring of 1827 on 27 acres of cherry orchard, just beyond the city limits. Watching from their windows, Philadelphia residents could see the massive walls rising, block by block, like some ancient citadel. The exterior wall alone would stretch over 1,000 feet in circumference, built of granite quarried from the banks of the Schuylkill River. Each block weighed nearly half a ton. The wall rose 30 feet high and 12 feet thick at its base, thick enough to withstand cannon fire, though what war they were preparing for, no one could say. As winter turned to spring in 1829, the first prisoners arrived. The registry shows their names in careful clerk's handwriting. Charles Williams, age 23, sentenced to 2 years for burglary. Joseph Clear, age 18, theft of a gold watch. Maria Hernandez, age 31, prostitution and disorderly conduct. They entered through massive oak doors reinforced with iron, crossing the threshold into what reformers promised would be their salvation. But salvation, as they would learn, wore the mask of madness. The genius of Haviland's design lay in its radial structure. 7 cell blocks extended like spokes from a central hub, where guards could observe every corridor with a single glance. It was architecture as omniscience, stone shaped into the eye of God. Each cell measured 8 by 12 feet, larger than most apartments of the working poor, reformers proudly noted, with running water, central heating, and a small exercise yard enclosed by walls 20 feet high. The heating system alone cost $6,000, a fortune that could have built a small mansion. Pipes snaked through the walls like arteries, carrying warmth from massive coal furnaces in the basement. Even in the depths of Philadelphia's bitter winters, no prisoner would freeze. They would have every comfort necessary for contemplation, every amenity required for repentance. Everything except human contact. The silence was immediate and absolute. Guards wore felt slippers to muffle their footsteps. When they spoke to prisoners, it was through iron slots in cell doors, their voices distorted by metal and stone. Prisoners were forbidden to speak, to sing, to make any sound that might penetrate the walls and reach another human soul. Even their names were taken from them, replaced by numbers sewn onto gray woolen uniforms. Charles Williams became prisoner number 1. In the ledgers, his identity reduced to entries of ink: height, weight, crime, sentence. The man disappeared. Only the number remained. The cells were technological marvels for their time. Each had a flush toilet, a luxury most Philadelphia homes lacked, connected to a sophisticated sewage system. Gas lamps provided light, controlled by guards from a central panel. In winter, steam radiators kept the temperature precisely regulated. Reformers boasted that conditions were superior to those in many of the city's finest hotels. But technology cannot cure the human need for companionship, cannot fill the emptiness that grows in the space between heartbeats when there is no other heart nearby to echo your own rhythm. The daily routine was designed with monastic precision. Prisoners woke at sunrise to the sound of a bell echoing through stone corridors. They dressed in silence, ate breakfast delivered through the metal slot, usually bread, sometimes porridge, occasionally a piece of salt pork. After eating, they worked at trades assigned by the administration: weaving, shoemaking, or tailoring. The work was meant to be redemptive, to instill discipline and useful skills. But the work was performed alone, always alone, in the 8 by 12-foot universe that had become their world. Some prisoners showed signs of improvement in the early months. Their conduct reports, filed weekly by guards, documented good behavior, adherence to rules, apparent engagement with the religious texts placed in every cell. The Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, moral treatises by approved authors. These became their only companions, their only windows into thoughts beyond their own. Reformers visited regularly, documenting what they saw as proof of the system's success. They interviewed prisoners through the metal slots, recording testimonials of repentance and reform. The reports they published glowed with optimism. Here was scientific proof that crime could be cured, that the human spirit could be purified through solitude and reflection. But the reformers' visits lasted minutes. They did not stay to hear the sounds that came after dark, when official silence gave way to something far more disturbing. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe arrived in the autumn of 1842, 13 years after Eastern State's doors first opened. Howe was no casual reformer, but a respected physician and educator, founder of the Perkins School for the Blind, a man whose observations carried weight in scientific circles. He came to study the effects of solitary confinement on the human mind, to document what he expected would be a triumph of enlightened penology. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. In cell block number 3, he met a man who had been in solitary confinement for 6 years. The prisoner, his name lost to history, reduced to a number in the ledgers, sat motionless on his wooden stool, staring at the wall. When Howe spoke to him, the man's head turned slowly, as if the simple act of recognizing another human voice required tremendous effort. The prisoner's speech came in whispers, broken by long pauses. He had forgotten how to modulate his voice for conversation, having heard only his own thoughts for so long that the distinction between internal and external speech had blurred. He spoke of visions. angels and demons dancing on the stone walls, voices calling his name from the ventilation shafts, colors that had no names in the gray world of his cell. Howe documented other cases. A young man who had convinced himself that his cell was slowly shrinking, that the walls moved inward by inches each night while he slept. Another who spoke only in rhymes, his mind having retreated into a private language of meter and verse. A woman who had stopped eating, certain that the food was poisoned by enemies who watched her through cracks in the mortar. The physician's reports, filed with state authorities, painted a picture far different from the glowing testimonials published by reform societies. The human mind, he wrote, was not designed to function in absolute isolation. Deprived of social interaction, the mind begins to feed upon itself, creating realities that exist nowhere but in the echo chamber of solitude. But his warnings went largely unheeded. Too much money had been invested, too many reputations staked on the success of the Pennsylvania system. Eastern State had become a symbol of American innovation in criminal justice, attracting visitors from around the world. European delegations toured the facility, returning home with plans to build similar institutions. The idea was spreading like a contagion of good intentions, paving the road to a very particular kind of hell. Winter arrived early in 1843, blanketing Philadelphia in snow that turned the streets white and pure. Inside Eastern State, the heating system worked perfectly, maintaining a comfortable temperature in every cell. But no amount of technological sophistication could warm the cold that had settled into the bones of the men and women trapped within those radial walls. The night guards reported increasingly disturbing sounds echoing through the corridors. Not the sounds of violence or rebellion, which they might have expected and known how to address, but something far more unsettling. The sounds of minds beginning to fracture under the weight of absolute solitude. From cell number 47 in the third block came a rhythmic tapping, hour after hour, as a prisoner beat his head against the stone wall with metronomic precision. Cell number 62 echoed with sobs that continued for days without pause, a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. In cell number 18, a man laughed. Not the bitter laugh of irony or the broken laugh of despair, but the laugh of someone who had found something genuinely amusing in the gray monotony of his existence, though what that something might be, no guard cared to investigate. The administration's response was to document these incidents as isolated cases of pre-existing mental instability. The prisoners, they maintained, had arrived at Eastern State already damaged by lives of crime and vice. The penitentiary was not creating madness. It was simply revealing madness that had always existed, bringing it into the light where it could be properly treated. But Dr. Howe's careful records told a different story. He had interviewed many of these same prisoners shortly after their arrival, when they showed no signs of mental disturbance. Their descent into madness followed a pattern. First came withdrawal from the limited human contact allowed during work assignments, then increasingly erratic behavior, then the creation of elaborate fantasy worlds, and finally, complete disconnection from consensual reality. The transformation typically took between 6 months and 2 years, though some prisoners succumbed more quickly. The stronger the mind, it seemed, the longer it took to break. But break they all did, in the end. The human soul, Howe concluded, was simply not designed to exist in the vacuum of absolute solitude. Charles Dickens arrived at Eastern State Penitentiary on March 8, 1842, during his first visit to America. The famous novelist came with notebook in hand, expecting to observe a marvel of progressive reform. Instead, he witnessed what he would later describe as torture more refined and more cruel than any devised by the Inquisition. Dickens was given the full tour, led through the radiating corridors by Warden Samuel Wood, who spoke with pride of the institution's innovations. The writer saw the heated cells, the individual exercise yards, the sophisticated plumbing systems. He observed prisoners at their work, weaving cloth and crafting shoes in the silence of their solitary worlds. But it was the eyes that haunted him. In cell after cell, he encountered men and women whose gazes had turned inward, whose attention had retreated so far from the external world that they seemed to be looking through him rather than at him. When they spoke, and many no longer did, their words came slowly, carefully, as if language itself had become foreign and dangerous. One prisoner, a former clerk convicted of embezzlement, had covered every inch of his cell walls with tiny writing. Using a nail he had somehow secreted, he had scratched thousands of words into the stone. Fragments of poetry, mathematical equations, imaginary conversations with family members he would never see again. The writing grew smaller and more cramped as it climbed toward the ceiling until the words became illegible. Then mere scratches. Then nothing. Another had created an elaborate mythology around the sounds that traveled through the prison's heating pipes. To him, these were not random noises, but messages from a vast conspiracy of fellow prisoners, all communicating in a code he alone understood. He spent his days composing replies, tapping out complex rhythms on the radiator, certain that his wisdom was being transmitted throughout the institution and beyond its walls to allies in the outside world. Dickens documented these encounters in his travel journal, writing by lamplight in his Philadelphia hotel room. The system here is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement. I believe it in its effects to be cruel and wrong. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. The novelist's account, published in American Notes, created a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. Here was no dry academic report but a vivid literary portrayal of institutional cruelty masquerading as reform. The book sparked debates in newspapers, scientific journals, and the halls of government. But still, Eastern State continued to operate according to its founding principles, still believing that solitude was the path to redemption. By 1844, 15 years after opening its doors, Eastern State housed nearly 400 prisoners. The building had expanded beyond Haviland's original design, with new cell blocks radiating outward like the arms of a stone octopus. The administration employed a staff of 47 guards, clerks, and administrators, all trained in the principles of the Pennsylvania system. The daily routine had been refined to mechanical precision. Every moment of every day was accounted for, scheduled, regulated. Prisoners woke to bells, ate according to predetermined menus, worked at assigned tasks, exercised in measured intervals, and slept when lights were extinguished from the central control station. It was order imposed upon chaos, discipline carved from stone and enforced through isolation. But beneath this surface of perfect regulation, something was festering. The medical records from this period, stored in yellowing files in the Pennsylvania State Archives, paint a picture of an institution in crisis. Monthly reports document a steady increase in what officials termed disciplinary problems, a euphemism for the increasingly erratic behavior of prisoners whose minds had begun to unravel under the pressure of absolute solitude. Cell checks revealed prisoners who had stopped maintaining basic hygiene, who sat motionless for days at a time, who had created elaborate shrines to imaginary deities using breadcrumbs and threads pulled from their uniforms. Some had begun speaking to invisible companions, carrying on lengthy conversations with voices only they could hear. Others had retreated into catatonic silence, unresponsive to commands, to threats, even to the offering of food. The prison physician, Dr. George Hockley, found himself treating conditions that had no names in medical textbooks of the time. Men who claimed their bodies were disintegrating, that their limbs were becoming transparent, that their hearts had stopped beating weeks ago. Women who insisted they were dead but somehow still conscious, trapped in bodies that were already beginning to decay. Dr. Hockley's reports to the State Health Department grew increasingly urgent. He requested permission to transfer the most severe cases to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, arguing that their conditions required specialized treatment beyond what the penitentiary could provide. His requests were denied. The prisoners had been sentenced to terms of solitary confinement, and solitary confinement they would serve, regardless of the cost to their sanity. The cost was becoming impossible to ignore. By winter of 1844, nearly 1 in 5 prisoners exhibited symptoms of what would later be recognized as severe psychological trauma. The administration's response was to classify these cases as malingering, deliberate attempts to fake mental illness in order to escape the rigors of proper punishment. But malingering could not explain the man found dead in cell number 93 on a February morning, his body unmarked by violence but his face twisted into an expression of such terror that even hardened guards averted their eyes. Nor could it account for the woman in cell number 15 who had somehow torn her fingernails away from her fingers in an attempt to claw through the stone wall, leaving trails of dried blood that traced geometric patterns across the gray surface. These were not the success stories that reform societies had promised. These were human beings destroyed by an institution designed to save their souls, minds shattered by the very isolation meant to encourage reflection and repentance. Yet the machine of Eastern State continued to operate, admitting new prisoners, processing them through the elaborate ritual of solitary confinement, documenting their inevitable descent into madness with clinical precision. The ledgers recorded it all. Names becoming numbers, sentences served in silence, human spirits broken against the stone wheels of progress and reform. And in the growing darkness of Philadelphia's winter nights, when snow muffled the sounds of the outside world, the corridors of Eastern State Penitentiary echoed with sounds that had no place in any vision of redemption or reform. They were the sounds of minds coming apart, souls dissolving in the acid of absolute solitude, human beings discovering that hell was not fire and brimstone but silence, isolation, and the terrible weight of being utterly, completely alone. The spring of 1845 brought more than just warming weather to Philadelphia. It brought visitors whose observations would forever change how the world viewed Eastern State Penitentiary. Among them was Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat whose writings on American democracy had already made him famous throughout Europe. But de Tocqueville came not to study politics, but to witness what many considered the most advanced prison system in the world. What he found disturbed him more than any battlefield he had ever seen. Walking through the hushed corridors with Warden Samuel Wood, de Tocqueville noted the architectural magnificence of the place. The vaulted ceilings soared 30 feet overhead, supported by Gothic arches that would not have looked out of place in a cathedral. Gas lamps flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows on walls built to last centuries. Everything spoke of permanence, of unwavering commitment to the principles of reform through isolation. But it was the prisoners themselves who captured his attention. In cell after cell, he encountered human beings who seemed to exist in a state between life and death, present in body but absent in spirit. One man, imprisoned for 3 years, had developed an elaborate ritual around his daily bread. He would break it into precisely 47 pieces, arrange them in complex, geometric patterns on his cell floor, and then consume them in a specific order that took exactly 90 minutes to complete. When de Tocqueville asked about this behavior, the man explained with perfect seriousness that the bread contained messages from God, and that failure to decode them properly would result in the destruction of the world. Another prisoner, a woman convicted of theft, had convinced herself that her cell was gradually expanding. She measured the walls daily using her own body as a ruler, documenting minute changes that existed only in her fractured perception. Her careful records, scratched into the stone with a fragment of metal, showed a cell that had allegedly grown from 8 by 12 feet to over 20 by 30 feet. A physical impossibility that she defended with mathematical proofs that made perfect sense within the logic of her broken mind. De Tocqueville's interpreter, a guard named Thomas Fletcher, had worked at Eastern State since its opening. Fletcher spoke in whispers as they moved through the cell blocks, explaining that many long-term prisoners had lost the ability to tolerate normal conversation. Loud voices sent them into panic. Sudden sounds triggered violent episodes. The human nervous system, Fletcher observed, was not designed for the absolute quiet that the Pennsylvania system demanded. In the prison's medical wing, de Tocqueville met Dr. Hockley, whose once optimistic views of solitary confinement had darkened considerably over the years. The physician led him through a corridor lined with cells housing prisoners who had suffered what he termed complete mental collapse. These were individuals who no longer responded to external stimuli, who sat motionless for days at a time, staring at walls, that had become their entire universe. Hockley showed de Tocqueville his medical records, thick ledgers filled with entries documenting the systematic destruction of human minds. Case after case revealed the same pattern: initial depression and anxiety, followed by paranoid delusions, then hallucinations, and finally complete withdrawal from reality. The progression was so predictable that Dr. Hockley had begun using it to estimate how long a prisoner's sanity would last based on their psychological profile upon arrival. The strongest minds, ironically, suffered the most. Intelligent prisoners, accustomed to mental stimulation and social interaction, deteriorated more rapidly than those with simpler cognitive structures. Education, rather than providing protection against madness, seemed to accelerate the process. The mind that had once navigated complex ideas and relationships found itself trapped in an 8 by 12-foot box with nothing to contemplate but its own decay. De Tocqueville documented the case of Professor Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant and former university lecturer who had been convicted of fraud. Müller arrived at Eastern State in 1842, an articulate man with a gift for languages and a passion for mathematics. Within 6 months, he had begun writing elaborate equations on his cell walls, claiming to have discovered a mathematical proof of the existence of God. By the end of his first year, the equations had devolved into meaningless symbols. By the end of his second year, he had stopped writing altogether and spent his days arranging and rearranging his few possessions in patterns that held significance only to him. When de Tocqueville interviewed Müller through the metal slot in his cell door, the former professor spoke in a mixture of German, English, and a language of his own invention. His words tumbled together in streams of consciousness that touched on quantum mechanics, biblical prophecy, and the dietary habits of angels. The brilliant mind that had once lectured on philosophy and mathematics had retreated into a private universe where logic followed rules known only to its creator. The French Observer's notes, later published in his report on American prisons, captured the horror of what he witnessed. Here, the punishment is not physical suffering, but the slow strangulation of the soul. The body remains healthy while the mind withers, like a plant deprived of sunlight. It is torture refined to its most cruel essence, the destruction of everything that makes us human while leaving the biological shell intact to suffer. Summer brought no relief to the prisoners of Eastern State, only a different quality of suffering. The stone walls that provided insulation from winter's cold now trapped the heat of Philadelphia's humid summers, turning cells into ovens despite the sophisticated ventilation system. But the physical discomfort paled beside the psychological pressure that built like steam in a closed vessel. Cell number 107 housed a man named James Morrison, a former merchant convicted of embezzlement. Morrison had been a pillar of Philadelphia society, church elder, father of 4, respected businessman whose downfall came through a series of increasingly desperate attempts to cover gambling debts. His family visited once, shortly after his sentencing, then disappeared from his life as completely as if they had never existed. By the summer of 1845, Morrison's 3rd year in solitary confinement, he had developed an elaborate fantasy in which his imprisonment was actually an elaborate test designed by God to prepare him for a divine mission. He believed that upon his release, he would be granted supernatural powers and commissioned to establish a new religion based on the revelations he had received during his isolation. His cell became a shrine to this delusion, decorated with intricate drawings created using his own blood mixed with dust from the stone walls. Morrison's case illustrates a phenomenon that Dr. Hockley had begun to document systematically: the creation of grandiose delusions as a psychological defense against the reality of powerlessness and abandonment. Prisoners who had lost everything, family, status, identity, compensated by creating internal narratives in which they were not victims, but chosen ones, not criminals but prophets, not forgotten but secretly significant beyond all imagination. The Guard reports from this period reveal an institution struggling to maintain the fiction of successful reform. Daily logs document increasingly bizarre behavior. Prisoners who spoke only in biblical verses, others who had convinced themselves they were already dead, some who claimed to have achieved the ability to leave their bodies and travel through the prison's ventilation system. The guards, initially trained to see such behaviors as signs of spiritual awakening, gradually began to recognize them as symptoms of systematic psychological destruction. Thomas Fletcher, the guard who had served since the prison's opening, submitted his resignation in August of 1845. His final report, preserved in the Pennsylvania State Archives, provides a rare glimpse into the thoughts of someone who had witnessed the entire experiment from its hopeful beginning to its horrifying present. I came to this place believing we were engaged in the Lord's work, that solitude would purify souls and return men to righteousness. Instead, I have watched good men driven to madness, and bad men made worse by their suffering. The silence we thought would bring them closer to God has instead created a vacuum where demons flourish. Fletcher's departure marked the beginning of a staffing crisis that would plague Eastern State for years to come. Guards requested transfers, citing the psychological toll of working in an environment where human suffering had been elevated to the level of science. Those who remained often became as isolated as the prisoners themselves, forbidden from speaking to inmates, witnessing daily the destruction of human minds, trapped in their own form of institutional solitude. The administration's response was to increase wages and tighten security protocols, treating the problem as one of discipline rather than recognizing it as a symptom of a fundamentally flawed system. New guards were recruited from rural areas, men less likely to be affected by what officials termed excessive sympathy for the prisoners. They were trained not to see the inmates as individuals, but as numbers, cases to be managed rather than human beings to be understood. But even the most hardened guards could not ignore what happened in cell number 62 during the autumn of 1845. The prisoner, a young man named Patrick Sullivan, convicted of burglary, had seemed to be adapting well to the solitary system. His conduct report showed no violations, his work assignments were completed satisfactorily, and his behavior during the weekly medical examinations appeared normal. On the morning of October 15th, guards conducting the routine cell inspection found Sullivan's body hanging from the gas fixture, a noose fashioned from strips of his prison uniform. But it was not the suicide itself that disturbed the guards. Self-inflicted death was becoming increasingly common at Eastern State. It was the condition of the cell that haunted their dreams for years afterward. Every surface had been covered with writing, thousands of words carved into the stone with fragments of the metal gas fitting. The text began coherently enough, documenting Sullivan's daily experiences and thoughts. But as the writing progressed across the walls and up toward the ceiling, it devolved into increasingly frantic repetitions of the same phrases. "Let me out, let me out, let me out," carved over and over until the words lost all meaning and became pure expression of desperation. The final message, carved above the improvised noose, read simply, "I forgot my own name." Dr. Hockley's examination of the scene revealed that Sullivan had been working on this project for months, carving a few words each night after lights out, documenting his own psychological disintegration in real time. The progression from rational thought to desperate repetition to final surrender provided a roadmap of madness that would haunt medical literature for decades to come. Yet still the experiment continued. New prisoners arrived weekly, processed through the same elaborate ritual of isolation, assigned to cells where they would begin their own journeys into the darkness that had claimed so many before them. The administrative machinery of Eastern State had achieved a momentum of its own, grinding forward regardless of the human cost, driven by institutional inertia and the refusal of its architects to acknowledge the magnitude of their error. Winter returned to Philadelphia with unusual severity in 1845, blanketing the city in snow that would not melt until March. Inside Eastern State, the heating system worked perfectly, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the complex. But no amount of physical warmth could penetrate the cold that had settled into the souls of the men and women trapped within those radial walls. The prison physician's monthly reports documented a new phenomenon: prisoners who had lost the ability to distinguish between sleeping and waking states. Prolonged isolation had blurred the boundaries of consciousness, creating a twilight existence where dreams and reality merged into an indistinguishable gray landscape. These individuals would respond to questions in their sleep, carry on conversations with hallucinated companions while appearing awake, and demonstrate complete confusion about basic facts like the time of day or the day of the week. Cell number 49 housed Maria Santos, a Spanish immigrant convicted of prostitution. Santos had been articulate and defiant upon her arrival, maintaining her innocence and demanding to speak with Spanish-speaking clergy. After 2 years in solitary confinement, she had developed what Dr. Hockley termed acquired mutism, the complete loss of speech, despite having no physical damage to her vocal cords. Santos would mouth words silently, her lips forming shapes that suggested desperate attempts at communication, but no sound emerged. When presented with paper and pencil, she would draw elaborate geometric patterns but could not or would not write words. Her eyes retained intelligence and awareness, but the connection between thought and expression had been severed by the trauma of absolute isolation. The case files from this period reveal the inadequacy of 19th-century medicine in dealing with what would later be recognized as severe psychological trauma. Dr. Hockley's treatments reflected the limited understanding of his era: cold water baths for hysteria, dias laudanum for nervous excitement, and bloodletting to reduce mental inflammation. These interventions often worsened the prisoner's conditions, adding physical suffering to their existing psychological torment. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the medical records is not what they reveal about individual cases, but what they demonstrate about the institutional mindset that allowed such suffering to continue. Each broken mind was documented as an isolated incident, a failure of the individual rather than the system. The possibility that the Pennsylvania system itself was fundamentally destructive was never seriously considered in official reports. The reformers who had championed Eastern states' creation found themselves in an impossible position. To acknowledge the mounting evidence of systematic psychological destruction would mean admitting that their grand experiment in criminal reform had become something monstrous. Too much political capital, too much money, too many reputations had been invested in the success of solitary confinement, so they doubled down on their commitment to isolation, attributing the disturbing reports to exaggeration by critics, to the inherent weakness of criminal minds, to anything except the possibility that their revolutionary system was slowly torturing people to death while calling it rehabilitation. And in the stone corridors of Eastern State Penitentiary, the machine of systematic madness continued its relentless work, consuming human minds with the efficiency of any industrial process, producing not reformed citizens, but broken shells of former human beings. Documented case studies in the limits of what the human psyche could endure before surrendering completely to the darkness of perpetual solitude. The year 1846 brought disturbing news from across the Atlantic that would shake the foundations of the Pennsylvania system. European prisons that had adopted solitary confinement based on Eastern states' model were reporting similar patterns of psychological breakdown. From London's Pentonville prison to Berlin's Moabit facility, administrators documented the same progression from isolation to insanity that had become routine in Philadelphia. Dr. Nikolaus Heinrich Julius, a Prussian prison reformer who had visited Eastern State during its early years and returned home to champion the solitary system, now wrote urgent letters to American colleagues warning of unforeseen consequences of the greatest magnitude. His own institution, constructed according to the Pennsylvania model, had experienced 17 suicides in its first 3 years of operation, a rate that exceeded even Eastern states' grim statistics. But in Philadelphia, these international reports were dismissed as evidence of improper implementation rather than fundamental flaws in the system itself. Warden Samuel Wood maintained that foreign administrators lacked the proper understanding of solitary confinement's spiritual dimensions. The problems reported in European prisons, he argued, resulted from treating isolation as mere punishment rather than embracing it as a pathway to divine redemption. This willful blindness to mounting evidence would define Eastern states' approach for years to come. Administrative reports from 1846 show an institution doubling down on its commitment to solitude, even as evidence of its destructive effects accumulated in filing cabinets and medical ledgers throughout the complex. Dr. Hockley's private correspondence, discovered in family papers decades later, reveals the personal toll of working within such a system. Writing to his brother in Boston, the prison physician described his daily routine. "I examine men who have forgotten how to speak coherently, women who have convinced themselves they are already dead, individuals whose minds have retreated so far from reality that they exist in worlds of pure delusion. Yet I am required to certify them as healthy enough to continue their sentences, to document their deterioration as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systematic torture." The spring of 1846 brought the case of William Morrison, no relation to the merchant James Morrison who had created the blood shrine in cell number 107. William Morrison was a Presbyterian minister convicted of embezzling church funds to support his gambling addiction. A man of education and deep religious conviction, he had arrived at Eastern State convinced that his imprisonment was divine punishment for his sins and that solitary confinement would provide the opportunity for genuine repentance. Morrison's theological training made him particularly susceptible to the psychological pressures of isolation. Denied human contact and left alone with his guilt and religious fears, he began experiencing what he interpreted as divine visions. These started as comforting experiences, imagined conversations with biblical figures who assured him of God's forgiveness. But as months passed in the stone silence of cell number 89, the visions darkened. Morrison came to believe that his cell was actually a way station between earth and hell, that the stone walls were gradually becoming transparent to reveal the fires of damnation burning just beyond. He could smell sulfur in the ventilation air, hear the screams of the damned echoing through the heating pipes. The Bible in his cell, he became convinced, changed its text each night to reveal new prophecies about the end times and his role in the coming apocalypse. Dr. Hockley's examination notes document Morrison's rapid deterioration. Patient exhibits severe auditory and visual hallucinations consistent with religious mania, claims to receive nightly visits from demonic entities who speak through the prison's mechanical systems, has ceased eating regularly, stating that food is unnecessary, as he has already died and is merely awaiting final judgment. Physical health remains adequate, but mental capacity has declined precipitously. Morrison's case became a particular source of embarrassment for prison administrators because his pre-incarceration status as a minister lent credibility to his accounts of spiritual experiences. When he began declaring that Eastern State was literally hell on earth, that the isolation cells were instruments of Satan designed to torture souls before their final damnation, his words carried a theological weight that secular critics lacked. The response from Reformed societies was swift and defensive. Roberts Vaux himself visited Morrison's cell, spending an hour in conversation with the deranged minister. Vaux's subsequent report described a man temporarily afflicted by the natural remorse of a guilty conscience, but fundamentally sound in his spiritual development. Morrison's disturbing claims were attributed to an excess of religious feeling rather than psychological breakdown. But Vaux's private diary, discovered by historians in the 1970s, tells a different story. Writing the night after his visit to Eastern State, the Quaker reformer admitted, "I looked into the eyes of William Morrison today and saw something that will haunt me until my death. This was not a man experiencing spiritual awakening, but a soul that has been systematically destroyed. God forgive us for what we have done in the name of redemption." The summer of 1846 brought a new development that would fundamentally alter Eastern State's operations: the arrival of Dr. Benjamin Rush Rees as assistant physician. Rees, a nephew of the famous Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had helped design the prison's original medical protocols, came to Eastern State with advanced training in what was then called mental philosophy, the 19th century precursor to psychology. Unlike Dr. Hockley, who had learned to view psychological breakdown as inevitable but regrettable, Dr. Rees approached the prison's mental health crisis as a scientific problem requiring systematic study. He began conducting detailed interviews with prisoners, documenting their psychological states at regular intervals, and comparing the mental health of those in solitary confinement with prisoners in other institutions who were housed in communal settings. His findings were devastating to the theoretical foundations of the Pennsylvania system. Rees discovered that prisoners who had been in solitary confinement for more than 6 months showed measurable cognitive decline in areas ranging from memory to basic reasoning ability. Those confined for more than 2 years demonstrated what he termed persistent disorganization of thought processes that appeared to be irreversible even after release from isolation. Most disturbing of all, Rees found that the psychological damage was cumulative and progressive. Prisoners didn't simply adapt to solitary confinement and reach a stable, if diminished, psychological state. Instead, they continued to deteriorate throughout their sentences, with each month of isolation adding layers of mental dysfunction that built upon previous damage. His report, submitted to the prison board in August 1846, recommended immediate modifications to the solitary system. At minimum, he argued, prisoners should be allowed brief periods of supervised social interaction to prevent complete psychological collapse. Ideally, the system of absolute isolation should be abandoned entirely in favor of what he termed modified solitude that would preserve the benefits of reflection while protecting prisoners' mental health. The board's response was to suppress Rees's report and reassign him to duties that didn't involve direct contact with prisoners. His scientific approach to prison psychology was deemed inconsistent with the spiritual goals of the Pennsylvania system. Mental health, board members argued, was a secondary consideration to the primary purpose of moral reform through isolation and reflection. Dr. Rees's forced silence didn't prevent word of his findings from reaching reform circles throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Letters between Reform Society members, preserved in various archives, show growing concern about reports emerging from Eastern State. The glowing testimonials that had characterized the prison's early years were being replaced by increasingly disturbing accounts of systematic psychological destruction. But the momentum of institutional inertia proved stronger than scientific evidence. Eastern State continued to operate according to its founding principles, admitting new prisoners to cells that had already claimed the sanity of previous occupants, documenting each case of mental breakdown as an isolated incident while refusing to acknowledge the pattern that connected them all. The autumn brought the case of Sarah Mitchell, a young woman convicted of infanticide whose trial had scandalized Philadelphia society. Mitchell, barely 19 years old, had been sentenced to 12 years in solitary confinement for the death of her illegitimate child, a crime she continued to deny despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Mitchell's youth and the nature of her alleged crime made her a particular focus of Reform Society attention. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the Pennsylvania system's ability to transform even the most hardened criminal through the power of solitary reflection and divine grace. Regular reports documented her progress, noting her apparent engagement with religious texts and her expression of remorse for past sins. But Dr. Rees, observing Mitchell during his brief tenure as prison psychologist, saw something far different from spiritual awakening. In his private notes, he documented a young woman whose grip on reality was slipping with each passing week. Mitchell had begun speaking to an imaginary baby that she believed lived in her cell, feeding it with portions of her own food, singing lullabies to empty air, changing invisible diapers with strips torn from her prison uniform. The religious remorse that Reform Society observers interpreted as evidence of moral transformation was actually Mitchell's attempt to appease the voices of dead children that she heard crying in the walls of her cell. Her engagement with biblical texts was driven by a desperate search for passages that might explain why God was punishing her with the sound of infant voices that never stopped weeping. Mitchell's case exemplified the fundamental misunderstanding that drove the Pennsylvania system. Behaviors that appeared to confirm the success of solitary confinement, withdrawal from worldly concerns, focus on spiritual matters, expressions of guilt and remorse, were often symptoms of psychological breakdown rather than evidence of moral improvement. The winter of 1846–47 was particularly severe, with temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks at a time. Eastern State's heating system, efficient as it was, couldn't prevent a different kind of cold from settling over the institution. This was the chill of mounting evidence that couldn't be ignored, the gradual recognition among staff members that they were participants in something monstrous. Guard Thomas Brennan, who had replaced the departed Thomas Fletcher, began keeping his own unofficial records of prisoner behavior. His journal, discovered during renovations in the 1960s, provides a first-hand account of institutional denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. The warden speaks of reform and redemption, but we guards see what really happens in these cells. Men who enter sane leave broken. Women who arrive frightened depart as empty shells. We are not running a prison but a factory for the manufacture of madness. Brennan documented specific incidents that never appeared in official reports. The prisoner who had eaten his own fingers down to the bone, claiming they had turned to bread. The woman who had convinced herself that her reflection in the small mirror provided for grooming was actually her twin sister trapped behind glass. The man who spoke only in numbers, having forgotten that words existed for concepts beyond mathematical relationships. These cases weren't isolated aberrations, but daily realities in an institution committed to the systematic destruction of human minds in the name of spiritual salvation. Yet the administrative machinery continued its relentless operation, processing each broken prisoner as evidence not of systematic failure, but of individual weakness, documenting each descent into madness as proof that the criminals had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The spring of 1847 brought visitors whose observations would finally begin to crack the wall of institutional denial that surrounded Eastern State. A delegation from the British Parliament, led by William Crawford, arrived to study American prison reforms for potential implementation in England. Crawford, an experienced prison administrator and social reformer, came expecting to observe the most advanced correctional system in the world. Instead, he encountered what he would later describe as scientific torture conducted under the banner of Christian charity. Walking through the silent corridors with Warden Wood, Crawford noticed details that escaped casual observers. The way prisoners flinched at unexpected sounds, their difficulty in making eye contact, the vacant expressions that suggested minds that had turned inward to escape an unbearable external reality. Crawford's interviews with long-term prisoners revealed the true cost of the Pennsylvania system. These were not the reformed criminals that reformed societies had promised, but human beings whose personalities had been systematically dismantled by years of absolute isolation. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, their conversations punctuated by long pauses as they struggled to remember how language worked in the presence of another human being. The British administrator's report, published upon his return to London, would eventually influence the abandonment of solitary confinement in British prisons. But in Philadelphia, his observations were dismissed as the prejudiced views of a foreign observer who couldn't understand the sophisticated spiritual dimensions of the Pennsylvania system. This pattern of denial would characterize Eastern State's response to criticism for years to come. Each damning report was explained away. Each piece of evidence was reinterpreted. Each sign of systematic failure was redefined as proof of the system's necessity and effectiveness. The institution had become trapped in its own mythology, unable to acknowledge the reality of what it had become without destroying the foundation of everything it claimed to represent. And so the machine continued its grinding work, consuming human minds with industrial efficiency while producing elaborate justifications for the suffering it caused. In the radiating cell blocks of Eastern State Penitentiary, the experiment in solitary confinement entered its 18th year, leaving behind a trail of broken minds and shattered souls that would stretch far beyond the prison's massive walls into the communities and families that would eventually receive back the hollow remnants of the human beings who had disappeared behind those doors. The year 1847 marked a turning point not in Eastern State's operations, but in the growing sophistication of its justifications for continued psychological destruction. As evidence mounted that solitary confinement was systematically destroying human minds, the institution's defenders developed increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain away the suffering they had created. Dr. Francis Lieber, a prominent political philosopher and prison reform advocate, visited Eastern State in the summer of 1847 and published a treatise titled On Solitary Confinement and the Reformation of Criminal Character. Lieber argued that the psychological disturbances observed in long-term prisoners were not evidence of systemic failure but proof that the system was working exactly as intended. The destruction of criminal personality patterns, he maintained, was a necessary prerequisite to spiritual rebirth. According to Lieber's theory, what critics called madness was actually a form of psychological molting, the painful but necessary shedding of corrupt mental structures to make room for moral transformation. The hallucinations, delusions, and cognitive disintegration documented by prison physicians were reframed as symptoms of spiritual labor, the birth pangs of souls struggling to emerge from criminal darkness into divine light. This theological rationalization found eager acceptance among reform societies, already heavily invested in the Pennsylvania system's success. Roberts-Vaux commissioned the printing of Lieber's treatise for distribution to prison administrators throughout the United States and Europe. The pamphlet became a cornerstone text for defenders of solitary confinement, providing intellectual cover for practices that were becoming increasingly difficult to defend on humanitarian grounds. But inside Eastern State itself, the reality of Lieber's spiritual labor looked very different from his theoretical descriptions. Cell number 97 housed Jonathan Cartwright, a former bank clerk convicted of embezzlement, who had spent 4 years in solitary confinement. Cartwright exemplified the kind of transformation that reform theorists celebrated. He had indeed shed his original personality completely. Dr. Hockley's medical notes describe a man who no longer recognized his own name, who insisted he was someone named Gabriel sent by God to prepare for the second coming of Christ. Cartwright spent his days arranging and rearranging his few possessions in patterns that he claimed were divine messages, complex geometric configurations that held profound spiritual meaning visible only to those who had achieved his level of enlightenment. When visitors observed Cartwright through the slot in his cell door, they saw a man apparently absorbed in spiritual contemplation, peacefully engaged with what appeared to be religious meditation. What they couldn't see was the complete disconnection from consensual reality that had replaced his former personality. Cartwright had indeed been transformed, from a troubled but functional human being into something that could no longer meaningfully be called sane. The autumn of 1847 brought an unexpected development that would test Eastern State's commitment to its founding principles. Pennsylvania's legislature, responding to mounting costs and growing criticism, proposed modifications to the solitary system that would allow limited social interaction among prisoners. The bill, known as the Prisoner Association Act, would have mandated group work sessions and communal religious services while maintaining individual cells for sleeping and reflection. The proposal triggered fierce debate throughout Philadelphia's reform community. Roberts-Vaux led the opposition, arguing that any deviation from pure solitary confinement would corrupt the system's spiritual benefits and return Pennsylvania to the barbaric practices of communal prisons. In a speech to the legislature, Vaux declared that compromise with evil is itself evil. We cannot allow the temporary suffering of criminals to blind us to the eternal salvation of their souls. Warden Samuel Wood submitted a detailed report opposing the legislation, documenting what he claimed were numerous success stories of prisoners reformed through solitary contemplation. His report included testimonials from former inmates who credited their transformation to the isolation experience, though investigation revealed that most of these individuals had been released in states of psychological collapse and were hardly reliable witnesses to their own recovery. The debate revealed the fundamental theological assumptions underlying the Pennsylvania system. For its defenders, solitary confinement was not simply a method of criminal punishment, but a sacred ritual of spiritual purification. Any modification of the system represented not mere policy change, but theological heresy, a rejection of divine truth revealed through American innovation. The legislature ultimately voted down the Prisoner Association Act by a narrow margin, influenced by intensive lobbying from reform societies and dire warnings about the consequences of abandoning Pennsylvania's leadership in correctional innovation. The decision ensured that Eastern State would continue its operations unchanged, that new prisoners would continue entering the stone machinery of systematic psychological destruction. Winter brought news from other institutions that had adopted the Pennsylvania model, reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of solitary confinement's effects across multiple prison systems. From Auburn State Prison in New York came accounts of prisoners who had developed what physicians termed prison psychosis, a condition characterized by complete withdrawal from external reality, inability to maintain coherent conversation, and elaborate delusional systems that filled the void left by human contact. The Ohio State Penitentiary reported 17 deaths by suicide among prisoners held in solitary confinement during 1847, a rate nearly 10 times higher than in the general prison population. Medical examiners noted that many of these deaths were preceded by periods of increasingly erratic behavior, suggesting that suicide represented the final stage of psychological deterioration rather than sudden desperation. Most troubling were reports from the Massachusetts State Prison, where administrators had begun releasing long-term solitary confinement prisoners early due to concerns about their mental condition. Follow-up studies revealed that these individuals showed persistent difficulties with social interaction, memory problems, and what would later be recognized as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress. The reformation that the Pennsylvania system promised was proving to be indistinguishable from permanent psychological damage. But at Eastern State, these reports were dismissed as evidence of improper implementation rather than fundamental problems with solitary confinement itself. Administrative memos from the period show a fortress mentality developing among staff and supporters, a determination to prove the system's success regardless of mounting evidence to the contrary. Dr. Hockley, increasingly isolated within the institution for his growing skepticism about solitary confinement's benefits, began conducting unauthorized research into the long-term effects of isolation. Working in secret during evening hours, he compiled detailed case studies of prisoners who had served more than 5 years in solitary confinement, documenting their mental condition at regular intervals. His findings, preserved in papers discovered decades later, painted a devastating picture of progressive psychological deterioration. Of 43 prisoners studied, 38 showed severe cognitive impairment after 5 years of isolation. Memory problems were universal, with most subjects unable to recall basic biographical information from their pre-prison lives. Language skills deteriorated markedly, with many prisoners losing the ability to construct coherent sentences or understand complex verbal instructions. Most disturbing was Dr. Hockley's documentation of what he termed reality dissociation syndrome, a condition in which prisoners lost the ability to distinguish between internal mental experiences and external events. These individuals lived in worlds where their hallucinations were indistinguishable from physical reality, where conversations with imaginary companions felt more real than interactions with guards or physicians. The case of Margaret O'Brien illustrates this phenomenon in particularly stark terms. O'Brien, convicted of arson and sentenced to 15 years in solitary confinement, had spent 7 years in cell number 43. Dr. Hockley's notes document her gradual retreat into a fantasy world where she was the queen of an elaborate court populated by invisible nobles who attended her daily activities. O'Brien would spend hours each day conducting formal conversations with these imaginary courtiers, discussing matters of state, issuing royal proclamations, and presiding over complex ceremonies that existed only in her fractured mind. To outside observers, she appeared to be engaged in bizarre solo performances, speaking to empty air and responding to voices only she could hear. But from O'Brien's perspective, these interactions were the most real and meaningful aspects of her existence. The gray stone cell had become a palace throne room, her prison uniform a royal robe, her meager meals elaborate banquets prepared by invisible servants. The delusion was so complete that attempts to interrupt her royal duties or question the reality of her court were met with the indignant outrage of a monarch whose authority had been challenged. Dr. Hockley's research revealed that such complete breaks from reality were not rare exceptions, but predictable outcomes of extended solitary confinement. The human mind, deprived of external stimulation and social interaction, began generating its own reality to fill the void. These internally generated experiences became increasingly vivid and compelling until they completely replaced the external world as the prisoner's primary frame of reference. The spring of 1848 brought a new challenge to Eastern states' operations in the form of the European revolutions that swept across the continent that year. Among the political refugees arriving in Philadelphia were several individuals with direct experience of solitary confinement in European prisons based on the Pennsylvania model. Their accounts of psychological torture conducted under the guise of reform began circulating in Philadelphia's immigrant communities, creating a new source of criticism for Eastern states' practices. Heinrich Müller, a German political prisoner who had spent 2 years in solitary confinement at Berlin's Moabit prison before escaping during the March Revolution, published a pamphlet titled The American Torture: How Solitary Confinement Destroys the Human Soul. Müller's account, written in fluent English and distributed throughout Philadelphia's intellectual circles, provided a first-hand description of the psychological effects that reform advocates preferred to discuss in abstract theoretical terms. Müller described the stages of mental deterioration with clinical precision. The initial period of defiant resistance giving way to depression and anxiety, followed by the onset of auditory and visual hallucinations, then the gradual loss of ability to distinguish between internal thoughts and external reality, and finally the complete retreat into private delusion systems that provided escape from unbearable isolation. His pamphlet included detailed descriptions of the physical effects of psychological stress, chronic insomnia, digestive problems, muscle tension that never relaxed, and what he termed prison palsy, uncontrollable tremors that affected prisoners who had spent years in solitary confinement. These physical symptoms, Müller argued, were evidence that solitary confinement was torture in the most literal sense, causing measurable harm to the human body as well as the mind. The response from Eastern states' defenders was swift and vicious. Roberts Vaux published a counter-pamphlet titled The Lies of Revolution: How Foreign Agitators Defame American Innovation, which attacked Müller's credibility and dismissed his account as the ravings of a criminal seeking to escape just punishment for his crimes against legitimate government. But Müller's pamphlet had struck a nerve precisely because it provided vocabulary and framework for understanding what many people had observed but struggled to articulate. The growing unease about Eastern states' operations, previously expressed only in whispered conversations and private correspondence, began to find public voice through the testimony of someone who had experienced the system's effects firsthand. The summer of 1848 saw the arrival of Dr. John McDowell, a physician and social reformer commissioned by the Pennsylvania Board of Public Charities to conduct an independent assessment of conditions at Eastern State. McDowell's investigation, ostensibly designed to address growing public concerns about prison conditions, was actually intended to provide official vindication of the solitary system and silence its critics once and for all. But Dr. McDowell proved to be less compliant than his sponsors had expected. Armed with advanced training in what was beginning to be called alienism, the study of mental illness, he approached his investigation with scientific rigor rather than ideological commitment. His methodology included structured interviews with current and former prisoners, systematic observation of daily operations, and detailed analysis of medical records spanning Eastern States' entire operational history. McDowell's preliminary findings, submitted as progress reports throughout the summer, gradually shifted from neutral observation to mounting alarm. His interviews with long-term prisoners revealed patterns of psychological damage that could not be explained away as pre-existing conditions or individual weakness. The systematic nature of the mental deterioration, its predictable progression, and its correlation with length of time in solitary confinement pointed to institutional rather than personal causes. The physician's final report, submitted to the Board of Public Charities in September 1848, would prove to be the most damning indictment of solitary confinement ever produced by an official investigation. McDowell concluded that the Pennsylvania system was inherently destructive to human mental health and recommended its immediate abandonment in favor of what he termed congregate confinement with structured rehabilitation programs. But the Board of Public Charities, composed largely of individuals with personal and political investments in Eastern states' success, voted to suppress McDowell's report and classify it as confidential. The physician's recommendations were rejected without public discussion. His services were terminated, and his findings were buried in filing cabinets, where they would remain hidden for nearly a century. The suppression of McDowell's report marked the complete triumph of institutional inertia over scientific evidence at Eastern State Penitentiary. The prison had become a closed system, immune to external criticism and internal reform, committed to perpetuating its practices regardless of their human cost. The machine of systematic psychological destruction would continue its work, consuming human minds while generating elaborate justifications for the suffering it caused, until forces beyond its control would finally bring the experiment to its inevitable end. And in the meantime, in the radiating cell blocks where hundreds of men and women struggled with the daily reality of absolute solitude, the true legacy of the Pennsylvania system continued to unfold. Not in the theoretical treatises of reform advocates, but in the broken minds and shattered souls of those who had become unwilling subjects in an experiment that had long since lost any connection to the humanitarian ideals that had inspired its creation.